It started with the smell. I stepped out one morning in my robe, coffee in hand, ready to start my usual Saturday routine: mowing, checking mail, maybe fixing that sagging fence post if I felt ambitious. But the second my foot hit the top step of my porch, I caught a whiff of something sharp. Chemical. Burning. I looked down the path toward my driveway, and my gut twisted. The concrete was discolored, dark, patchy, and smoking in spots. I dropped my mug and sprinted down the steps. What the hell? The acid had eaten through the top layer of my driveway. Not spilled. Poured. Deliberate. My name's Elias Langford. I'm a contractor by trade. Live in a modest 2-story brick home on a cul-de-sac in Brookhollow Pines, a place that looks nice enough on paper until you meet the HOA. And leading that HOA like some self-crowned queen? Barbara Kingsley. 50-something, bleach blonde bob, pearl necklace every damn day, and a voice that could shatter a windshield if you caught her in the right mood. Barbara's the kind of woman who doesn't ask if you mowed your lawn, she measures it. I knew immediately she had something to do with this. 2 months ago, she'd been hounding me about my non-regulation gravel edging on my driveway. Apparently, the crushed granite border I installed myself wasn't in her sacred HOA handbook. She slapped me with a citation, then another, then a final warning. I ignored them all. Turns out, that doesn't sit well with Barbara. Elias. You might want to be more careful about chemical spills, she called from across the street, appearing out of nowhere like a vulture in yoga pants. I turned slowly. She was standing next to her precious hydrangeas, arms crossed, wearing that smug little expression she always wore when she thought she'd won.
Funny, I said.
I was gonna say the same to you. Know anything about acid, Barbara? Her smile twitched. I'm not the one with a damaged driveway, Elias. Maybe if you paid your fines on time, you'd have money left for repairs. That's when I knew. She wanted me to pay the HOA fines. And this was her play. Destroy the driveway, claim it was my fault, then fine me for the eyesore. I crouched and took out my phone. I snapped photos of the damage, the burn marks, the trail of chemical droplets leading from the sidewalk. I followed it. It wrapped around the bushes, across the lawn, right to her side of the street. She didn't even try to hide it. By Monday morning, I'd filed a police report. The officer who came out took one look at the burns and whistled low. This isn't some weed killer, he said. Looks like muriatic acid. Industrial strength. I told him about Barbara. About the fines. The threats.
The trail.
She poured it to force me into paying HOA fees, I said. She's been trying to break me for months. He nodded. You got any cameras? That's when I grinned for the first time in days. Actually, yeah. Installed one last month after she tried to file a noise complaint about my power drill at noon. I pulled up the footage on my home system. Sure enough, there she was, Barbara freaking Kingsley, hauling a jug out of her garage around 2 a.m. Black gloves. Hoodie. She crept across the street like it was some spy mission, crouched low, and started pouring the acid in a neat little zigzag across my driveway. The officer leaned forward. Well, I'll be damned. By Wednesday, Barbara had been served. But she wasn't sweating.
Not yet.
Instead, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting Thursday night. I showed up just to see what stunt she'd pull next. The little clubhouse was packed. Most of the residents were there. Barbara stood at the front next to her 2 lackeys, Janet and Rhonda, grinning like she was about to give an Oscar speech. Due to recent events, she said, I'd like to propose a special maintenance fee for chemical spill cleanup, starting at $2,000 per affected property. I stood. You mean my property? The one you vandalized?
Gasps.
Whispers. Barbara's smile didn't even falter. You have no proof of that, Elias. Just wild accusations. I turned to the crowd. I have video proof. Want to see it? Silence. Then murmurs. I have a high-def camera pointed at my driveway. It caught everything. Barbara crossing the street in the dead of night. acid jug in hand, pouring it across my concrete like it was fertilizer. Barbara's face twitched. "You're bluffing," she said. "Am I?" I pulled out my laptop and turned it toward the front row. Press play. There she was, big as life. The hoodie didn't help her one bit. Her walk, her posture hell, even her dumb little sneakers with the pink laces clear as day. The room exploded. Janet looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Rhonda actually backed away from Barbara like she suddenly smelled bad. Barbara, is that really you?" someone asked. "She poured acid on his driveway?" Barbara's voice cracked. "It was a preventative measure." His weeds were spreading. He was lowering property values. They were crushed granite, I interrupted. "And you did this to force me into paying fake fees. That's vandalism. And assault, if I'd been out there." A man in the back yelled, "We're not paying for your crimes, Barbara." The officer who'd been investigating stepped into the room just then, like fate itself had RSVP'd. He walked right up to Barbara. "Barbara Kingsley, you're under arrest for property damage, trespassing, and reckless endangerment." The room went dead quiet. Barbara's mouth flapped. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." "And now you're a criminal," I said. He cuffed her right there in front of the whole neighborhood. And for the first time in years, Brookhollow Pines felt like home again. The morning after Barbara was taken away, I walked outside to a street that felt lighter. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before nodded at me, some waved. Old Mr. DeWitt, who usually kept to himself behind his hedges, actually shuffled over with a grin and a thermos of what turned out to be the strongest black coffee I've ever tasted. "About time someone stood up to her," he muttered, pouring me a steaming cup in my driveway. "I've lived here 15 years. Never seen her get called on her garbage before." I thanked him and took a slow sip, watching the faint outlines of acid burns fade into the drying concrete. The damage was already setting in deep pits and cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. It wasn't just cosmetic. I'd have to tear up the whole slab and repower it. And that meant money. A lot of it. I've worked construction sites and done my fair share of home renovations, but concrete work on this scale wasn't something I could just handle on weekends. I'd need a crew, permits, and at least 5 days of dry weather. The estimate from a friend who owed me a favor came in at just over $11,000. I didn't have that kind of cash lying around, especially not after a slow winter season. So I made a decision. I wasn't just going after her through the police. I was taking her and the HOA to court. By that afternoon, I was in my cousin Ray's office downtown. Ray's a civil litigation attorney with a sharp jaw, sharper suits, and a reputation for turning neighborhood disputes into courtroom bloodbaths. "She poured acid on your driveway?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "That's not petty. That's malicious destruction of property, Elias. That's jail time, and if we're lucky, a civil payout." "She did it to force me to pay fake fines," I said. "She's been targeting me for months. And it wasn't just me. She's shaken down half the neighborhood." Ray flipped through the stack of documentation I'd brought: photos, HOA letters, the police report, and a printed transcript from the emergency meeting where she'd tried to push a bogus chemical cleanup fee. "This is gold," he said, tapping the page. "But we're not just suing her. We're going after the HOA as an entity. If they funded her or knew what she was doing and didn't stop her, they're liable too." "They signed off on her behavior," I said. "Janet and Rhonda were in every meeting. They backed her on every decision." Ray nodded slowly, already clicking through legal documents on his screen. "We'll hit them with property damage, emotional distress, and civil conspiracy. I'll need your security footage, all HOA correspondence, and any neighbors who are willing to testify about similar behavior." "I think they'll line up to talk," I said. "She made a lot of enemies." The lawsuit was filed within the week. Word spread fast. I wasn't subtle about it. Flyers went out to every mailbox in the HOA's jurisdiction. explaining in plain terms what Barbara had done and inviting anyone with similar experiences to contact Ray's office. That's when the real stories started pouring in. One neighbor, a young veteran named Marcus, told us Barbara had threatened to report him for illegal modifications when he built an access ramp for his wheelchair-bound mother. Another woman, Clara, said Barbara fined her $400 for having unauthorized flora in her front yard lavender, of all things. Ray compiled every statement, every HOA document we could get our hands on, and filed an amended complaint with over a dozen residents attached as co-plaintiffs. Meanwhile, Barbara had posted bail and was back home. But she wasn't strutting anymore. Her porch lights stayed off at night. Her trash bins vanished from the curb like clockwork. She didn't show her face at HOA meetings, which were now being held under interim leadership by a quiet, nervous man named Alan, who looked like he'd rather eat glass than stand at the front of a room. At our first court hearing, Barbara's attorney, a stiff, gray-suited man who looked like he billed by the second, tried to push for dismissal. "Your Honor," he said, "this is a simple act of vandalism, not a civil conspiracy." Ms. Kingsley acted alone. Ray stood immediately. "We have video evidence of the defendant committing a criminal act, testimony from multiple residents about a pattern of coercive behavior, and documentation showing the HOA's direct involvement in fraudulent citations. This isn't vandalism. It's a systematic abuse of authority." The judge, a tall woman with sharp eyes, nodded slowly. "Motion to dismiss denied. Proceed." Barbara didn't look up once during the proceedings. Her posture was stiff, her hands clenched. Discovery phase began, and that's when we hit the jackpot. Ray subpoenaed HOA records, emails, meeting notes, internal memos. What we found made my stomach turn. Barbara had created unofficial violation tiers and directed HOA board members to target certain homes based on visual non-compliance. In one email, she referred to Marcus as a liability with a military complex. In another, she called me a stubborn contractor who needs to be financially corrected. Even worse, there were budget documents showing that fine revenue had been rerouted into a beautification fund that paid for Barbara's backyard landscaping, a new patio set, and monthly consulting fees to her cousin who lived 3 states away and had never set foot in Brookhollow Pines. Ray nearly dropped his coffee when he read that last part. "They cooked their own books," he said. "This isn't just civil court anymore. This is fraud. Embezzlement. Racketeering, maybe." He forwarded the documents to the district attorney. 2 weeks later, a second round of arrests came down. Barbara was picked up again, this time in front of her house, while trying to sneak hedge trimmers into her trunk. Janet and Rhonda were taken from their offices downtown. Alan, the interim president, resigned immediately after the raid and issued a public statement disavowing the former board. The HOA was suspended by the county pending a full audit. I showed up to the next neighborhood gathering with a folding chair and a cooler full of sodas. People actually clapped when I walked in. "You're the reason we're getting our lives back," Clara said, handing me a slice of banana bread wrapped in foil. "You didn't just stop her. You exposed everything." "I just wanted my driveway back," I said, but she shook her head. "You gave us all a reason to speak up." The court date for our civil suit finally came. Barbara pled not guilty, of course, but the evidence was airtight. Between the video, the financial records, and the testimonies from over a dozen residents, the jury didn't take long. They found Barbara liable on all counts. The HOA board members were hit with damages too. Between the criminal charges and the civil penalties, Barbara was forced to sell her house, her car, and most of her assets. The court awarded me full reimbursement for the driveway, plus damages for stress, legal fees, and loss of property use, over $19,000 in total. The other plaintiffs received similar judgments. Ray and I stood outside the courthouse afterward, the spring sun warming our faces. "You ever think about running for HOA president?" he asked, half joking. I laughed. I think I've had enough of HOA politics for one lifetime. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not really. We had cleaned house, sure. But now came the hard part: rebuilding trust, redrafting the bylaws, and making sure no one like Barbara ever got that kind of power again. Brookhollow Pines wasn't perfect, but it was ours again. And this time, we'd protect it together. 2 months after the verdict, Brookhollow Pines was almost unrecognizable, and not just because the HOA board had been replaced or the acid-stained driveway was gone. The entire tone of the neighborhood had shifted. People who used to duck their heads and mumble about citations were now holding weekend barbecues and waving from porches. The fear that had once hung over everything like a fog had lifted. But the scars went deeper than burned concrete. Barbara's arrest had revealed more than just her personal vendetta against me. The county audit, which started quietly and then snowballed into a full-blown investigation, uncovered that the HOA had been engaging in financial misconduct for nearly 6 years. It wasn't just the landscaping embezzlement or the fake consulting fees. They'd been manipulating property valuations to target certain homeowners with inflated assessments, funneling the difference into discretionary funds that were never publicly itemized. The auditor's report was 132 pages long. I read every word. It detailed how Barbara and her inner circle had used the HOA structure to punish anyone who resisted fabricated fines, withheld approvals for home improvements, and even coordinated anonymous complaints to justify forced property inspections. But the worst part was buried in Appendix D. There was a property seizure. A man named Kurt Hollis, who had lived at the edge of the subdivision, had been forced to sell his home under duress 3 years prior. The HOA had claimed he violated community guidelines by keeping unpermitted structures in his backyard, a pair of tool sheds he'd had since before Brookhollow Pines was even established. When he refused to remove them, they stacked fine after fine until they levied a lien. They forced a sale through a third-party affiliate who, as it turned out, was Barbara's nephew. The house flipped within 6 weeks for nearly double the price. Kurt had been given barely half the market value. I tracked him down, took a few calls to the county clerk and a real estate agent who remembered the sale. When Kurt opened the door to his small rental unit outside city limits, he looked surprised to see me. He was in his 60s, lean with sun-damaged skin, and the kind of eyes that had seen too much. "You from the paper?" he asked.
No, I said.
"I live in Brookhollow Pines. Or what's left of it." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he stepped aside. Inside, the place was neat but sparse. Folding chairs instead of couches. A TV from another decade. The only things that looked like they belonged were the toolboxes lined up against the wall. "I read about Kingsley," he said, settling into a chair. "Didn't expect her to finally get nailed, to be honest."
You were targeted, I said.
"I saw the audit. What they did to you, it wasn't just wrong. It was criminal." He gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "I told people. No one listened. Wrote letters. Held meetings. She shut me down at every turn. Said I was disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood." He leaned forward. "You're the contractor, right? The one with the acid driveway." I nodded. He stood and went to a cabinet, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and dropped it on the table. Everything I tried to file. County records, photos, letters. They claimed my sheds were a code violation, but I had permits from the 90s. None of it mattered. They just wanted me gone. I opened the envelope and scanned the first few pages. His paperwork was airtight. There were signatures, time-stamped photos, even a letter from the original developer confirming the structures had been grandfathered in. "They stole your house," I said. "No one cared," he said. "Until now." I took the envelope and promised to bring it to Ray. Back at Ray's office, I laid everything out on his desk. "This isn't just civil anymore," I said. "This is criminal theft of property." Ray read through the documents, growing more tense with each page. If this holds up, and it looks like it does, we're talking conspiracy to commit fraud and unlawful transfer of real estate. This wasn't a fine. This was a coordinated seizure. We filed a motion to reopen the case, not just to get Kurt restitution, but to expose the full scale of the corruption. The DA's office was already knee-deep in indictments from the HOA audit. When they saw Kurt's file, they launched a new investigation, this time into the real estate transactions overseen by the HOA's so-called Special Acquisitions Committee. Turns out, Kurt wasn't the only one. 2 more families had been forced to sell under threat of foreclosure. One had moved out of state. The other had been living in a camper for the past year, too ashamed to tell anyone they'd lost their house to a neighborhood board. Within 3 weeks, the county filed felony charges against Barbara's nephew, 2 former HOA treasurers, and a real estate agent who had quietly facilitated the transfers without proper disclosures. The news broke across local media. Cameras showed up at council meetings. Reporters stood outside the HOA's former clubhouse, which now sat locked and unused. But not everyone was thrilled. Some of the long-time residents, those who had benefited from Barbara's reign or looked the other way, started getting defensive. They muttered about witch hunts and overreach. They said things like, well, maybe those people should have followed the rules, conveniently forgetting that the rules had been manipulated. At the next open community forum, I stood up and addressed the crowd. Let's be clear, I said. This isn't about rules. This is about abuse of power. Barbara didn't enforce standards, she weaponized them. She used the HOA to punish dissent, to enrich herself, and to drive people out of their homes. We can't pretend that didn't happen just because our lawns look nice. A few people clapped. A few shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. After the forum, Alan approached me, the former interim president who had resigned after the arrests. I want to make things right, he said. I know I was part of the board, but I didn't realize how deep it went. I was afraid to speak up. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth. Then help us rebuild it, I said. We're drafting a new charter. No secret committees. Full transparency. Term limits. And a clause that lets residents dissolve the HOA with a 2/3 vote. He nodded slowly. I'll help. The new charter took shape, written by a committee of residents, not lawyers in back rooms or hand-picked allies. We held 4 open workshops, invited feedback from every homeowner, and made sure no one could ever again control the neighborhood from behind closed doors. Kurt came back to visit during the 3rd workshop. He stood by the back wall, quiet and observant, until someone recognized him and the room broke into applause. He didn't say much, just nodded and smiled faintly, but I could see the weight lifting off his shoulders. A few weeks later, the county approved restitution from the seized property sales. Kurt got a settlement. The others did too. Not enough to erase what happened, but enough to start again. Barbara's trial for the real estate scheme was scheduled for the fall. Her attorney was already trying to negotiate a plea. The charges: fraud, conspiracy, unlawful property seizure carried real time. Her house had been sold at auction. The patio furniture she bought with HOA funds? Confiscated by the state. Ray and I sat on my new porch one evening, fresh concrete beneath our feet, a cold drink in hand. You know, he said, you could have just replaced the driveway and let it go. Yeah, I said, but then she'd still be out there, still running things, still ruining lives. He nodded. Well, she picked the wrong contractor. The porch light flicked on as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Across the street, kids played tag on the sidewalk. Someone grilled burgers 2 houses down. The smell drifted through the air. Brookhollow Pines wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was honest now. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like a place worth fighting for. The county finally disbanded the Brookhollow Pines Homeowners Association in the last week of August. It wasn't a dramatic affair, no ribbon cutting, no speeches. Just a legal notice filed with the clerk's office and a copy distributed to every homeowner, printed on plain white paper with a blue county seal stamped in the corner. But anyone who'd lived under Barbara Kingsley's rule knew it was monumental. The document was short. The HOA, as previously structured, was dissolved. The new Residence Committee would function in a purely advisory capacity, no enforcement powers, no fines, no mandatory fees. The audit findings had been irrefutable, and the county wasn't about to let that kind of unchecked authority creep back in through a new name or friendly language. I read the notice twice, standing in my kitchen with the morning sun cutting across the tile.
It should have felt like the end.
But I knew better. The night before, I'd received a call from Detective Liana Mercado, the same officer who'd helped secure the first round of charges against Barbara. "There's something you need to see," she'd said. "It's about the properties they flipped." By noon, I was sitting across from her in a plain interview room at the county precinct. She slid a manila folder across the table. The name on the front jumped out at me: Brookhollow Pines Parcel Reassignments. I opened it and scanned the top page. Then the second. Then the third. Each one listed a property that had been acquired by the HOA over the last 5 years. But these weren't just the houses we already knew about. There were 7 more. 7 homes that had been quietly transferred under obscure legal justifications, code enforcement seizures, lien consolidations, and in one case, abandonment due to community noncompliance. "They took abandoned homes?"
I asked.
"They made them look abandoned," Mercado said. "Shut off utilities, redirected mail, even changed the exterior to make it look like no one lived there. One of the residents was out of the country for medical treatment. Came back and found her house sold." My jaw clenched. That's not just fraud. That's organized theft.
Mercado Nariz.
"We're treating it as a racketeering case now. The DA's office is preparing federal charges." How did no one catch this sooner? They were careful. Spread the transfers across different entities, shell corporations, fake holding trusts. But we pull the incorporation records. All of them trace back to the same P.O. box. Guess who rented it? I didn't have to guess. "Barbara," I said. "And her nephew," Mercado added. "He signed off on at least 4 of the deeds himself as a trustee. We're talking wire fraud, interstate property theft, and falsification of public documents. What happens now? We're seizing the properties, reversing the transfers where possible, and everyone involved is getting indicted." I leaned back in the chair, absorbing it. She really thought she'd get away with it.
"She almost did," Mercado said.
"If you hadn't caught her on camera, none of this would have unraveled." When I got home that evening, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. The kids stayed indoors, the usual lawnmower hums absent. I realized most people were waiting, watching for the next shoe to drop. It did. 3 days later, federal agents raided a converted warehouse 20 miles outside the city. It was registered as a community storage facility under a nonprofit name. Inside, they found documents, forged records, blank property deeds, and over $200,000 in cash. They also uncovered a hidden server room, encrypted drives, transaction logs, and emails that tied Barbara and her group to a network of fraudulent filings spanning across 2 counties. One of the agents described it as the most sophisticated HOA-related fraud scheme he'd ever seen. Barbara was arrested again, this time by federal marshals. Her mugshot made the local news, and the headline ran for 3 days straight: "Former HOA president accused of orchestrating multi-million-dollar property scam." This time, there was no bail. Neighbors gathered at Clara's house that night. Her back patio became the unofficial town hall. We sat in mismatched lawn chairs, passing around bags of chips and warm soda, the air crackling with disbelief. 7 more houses? Marcus said, shaking his head. And we didn't know a thing.
"They made sure we didn't," I said.
It was all smoke and mirrors. Fake citations, hidden transfers, forced listings. And they did it under the banner of community standards. Alan stood with his back to the fence, arms folded. We have to make sure something like this can never happen again. Not just here. Anywhere. I looked at him. You thinking what I'm thinking? He nodded. We write a bill. That was how the Brookhollow Initiative was born. In the weeks that followed, we formed a committee, not just residents, but legal experts, former inspectors, and even one retired judge who'd once ruled on HOA cases. Our goal was to draft legislation that would limit HOA powers across the state. No more secret fines. No more property seizures. Mandatory transparency, third-party audits, and legal oversight for every enforcement action. Ray volunteered to write the first draft. By October, we'd collected over 5,000 signatures. Local representatives took notice. One councilwoman, a former housing advocate named Teresa Alvarez, agreed to sponsor the bill at the state level. She visited the neighborhood on a windy Saturday afternoon. We gave her a tour, showed her where residents had been pushed out, where fake citations had been posted. She listened, took notes, and promised to see it through. This isn't just about one neighborhood, she said. This is about protecting people from unchecked authority disguised as civic duty. The bill went to committee in November and passed with overwhelming support in February. The governor signed it into law on a rainy Thursday morning. It was the first statewide legislation to directly curtail HOA seizure powers and fine structures. They called it the Langford Act. I didn't ask for that name, but I didn't fight it either. By spring, the community had begun to heal in earnest. The properties that had been illegally transferred were returned to their former owners or, in cases where that wasn't possible, placed in a trust to fund affordable housing. Kurt moved back into his old house. The county had repaired the roof and repainted the exterior. When I stopped by to check in, he was unloading a new set of tools from the back of a borrowed pickup. Feels like I never left, he said, setting a drill case on the porch. Except now, I don't feel like I have to look over my shoulder. Barbara's trial began in early June. She faced 16 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and unlawful seizure of property. Her defense team tried to paint her as a well-meaning but misguided leader.
The jury didn't buy it.
The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation, guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Her nephew got 15. Janet and Rhonda, who had cooperated with investigators, received reduced sentences and were barred from serving on any residential board for life. It was over. At the next community gathering, we didn't talk about lawsuits or citations or bylaws. We grilled hot dogs. We played music. Someone brought out sparklers, and the kids danced in the fading light. Clara walked over and handed me a glass of iced tea. You think we'll ever forget all this?
I hope we don't, I said.
People forget, they get complacent. That's how it starts again. She nodded. Then we'll remember. Together. The sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. I looked at the houses, the same structures that had once felt like cages. Now they were just homes.
No hidden agendas. No fake committees.
Just people rebuilding what had been taken from them. Brookhollow Pines had been broken, but we'd repaired it not just with concrete and paint, but with truth, resilience, and the one thing Barbara never counted on, a neighborhood that refused to be controlled.